Hello, friends.
Oh,
He really wanted to do that.
nailed it. Eat that stuff. Take it.
Welcome to another episode of Hybrid Unlimited. Today, it's me, and co-hosting is Jordan Shallow, because I'm still stuck in Canada trying to work on getting a visa to get back. But that's a story for another time. Today, we have Dr. Evan Rodriguez on the podcast. He's an anesthesiologist by specialty, focusing on microdose psychedelic therapies. So his main role is in anesthesiology, doing general anesthesia and sedation for patients undergoing procedures. And the interest in alternative therapies is because he saw a need to promote access to those treatments. We dive into all of that. It's actually really nice to have a clinical perspective on these types of psychedelic drugs, because my exposure to it prior to this has literally just been hippie friends telling me that all drugs are medicine. And that might be true, but it also might not be true. So it's nice to hear it from a doctor. Quick shout out to our sponsor, LMNT. It's a great tasting electrolyte drink mix with everything you need and nothing you don't. That means lots of salt with no sugar. LMNT is formulated to help anyone with their electrolyte needs and is perfectly suited for folks following a keto, low carb, or paleo diet. LMNT contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio: 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, 60 milligrams of magnesium, with none of the junk. No sugar, no coloring, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. If you want to check these guys out, this is something that Stephanie and I use all the time. Check them out at drinklmnt.com/hybrid. This podcast episode is also brought to you by Beam. Beam is committed to producing high-quality, natural, innovative wellness products trusted by some of the world's top professional athletes. Beam creates products to support 4 main categories: balance, performance, recovery, and sleep. These products are combined of both CBD and non-CBD ingredients. By tapping into how we function biologically, CBD can work to regulate pain, mood, appetite, anxiety, and inflammation. As a Hybrid Unlimited listener, you get 15% off your order with code HYBRID in all caps. So check them out. That's Beam, and use code HYBRID in all caps for 15% off. And that's it. Let's sit back, relax, and enjoy another episode of Hybrid Unlimited.
It's so cool working with actual professionals. It's so rare for us on the internet. I thought about one day just doing the podcast in scrubs just to feel more legit.
Yeah,
it's like,
I got this from my other job.
Yeah, like a real job.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's rare. You have no idea how rare that is in our world to talk to people with real jobs. Like, he doesn't have a promo code. 0 promo code. Could you imagine? Just use code MD at checkout for your ketamine.
It should be that easy eventually, hopefully.
How did you get into it? Like, what first sparked your interest with ketamine? Because, like, in our world, getting into weightlifting was like, I was in high school and I lifted with a wrestling coach. But it's like, I hope that's not the same story with you. It's like, I was in high school and I did ketamine with a wrestling coach.
No, I actually, my experience with ketamine is not a personal one. It's a professional. When I was training, it was a great drug to use as an anesthesiologist. It was almost an ideal drug as an anesthetic, but there was always some negative connotation with it, and I wasn't sure why. When I asked to use it during training on patients, there was a lot of resistance with the other anesthesiologists, and they just said, patients don't want it, patients don't need it, and I wasn't sure why. And it was kind of the wondering why there was such hesitation that sparked my interest in it. And the more I looked into it, I couldn't find a valid reason why we aren't using it more in the operating room. And that just sparked my interest in learning about the medication ketamine. And I realized that there's so many other uses for it, and it's kind of a political reason why, or social political reason why, it just has a bad name. It's a recreational drug, so
what's
they preclude it and push it aside.
What's the traditional purpose? Like, what was that drug made for initially?
Well, initially it was made in a lab. It was made we had PCP, which is a psychedelic drug, and they wanted to get the good effects from it, the anesthetic effects, the pain effects from it, without all the negative side effects of tripping out. And they did a good job with ketamine. It's a very short-acting medication that does still have some dissociative effects, which we could talk about later. It's actually beneficial. But they use it as a potent anesthetic. They designed it specifically for the way it's used now. Is It's pain control. It's a dissociative, so you're not aware of really what's going on for a very short period of time. So they can do an operation and it wears off, and when the operation is done, you're kind of recovered quickly. So it was designed to do exactly what it's doing. Unfortunately, it was taken off as a party drug soon afterwards, because you can do ketamine, in raves and everything, and that kind of pushed it away socially as a legitimate medication.
So at what point in your training, did you start to realize that some of the pushback was coming from the social stigma around the spin-off uses of ketamine as like a more recreational party drug?
I mean, it's available in all hospitals. It's actually required by the World Health Organization. It's one of the essential medications. So we had it available, and it would just be sitting in the pharmacy area. So I realized when I use it, and I did have some coworkers that were happy to use it, that we'd have such positive effects from it, and the patient care was improved, and we can do quick cases without them having long-acted narcotics and having long recovery time. But again, I when we did use it, we had such good effects from it that I realized that there's something to it. The other side of it is it's a generic medication, so it's pennies. It's under $1 for one bottle, for one dose for a patient, and that's kind of one of the other reasons socially or not so politically why it's not really taken off, is because pharmaceutical companies cannot make money from it. It's a generic medication. Any producer can make ketamine. It's not name brand. So that's the other pushback from it.
So you were introduced to it through being an anesthesiologist, but
yes,
now the purpose you use it is you've kind of switched to a different route, right? Like you're using it for a completely different reason with people who have all sorts of different issues they're trying to address. Can you speak on that?
Right.
A little bit?
I was always interested in other aspects of the use of it. As an anesthesiologist, we kind of overlap a lot with pain management, and that's kind of where it started to branch off. Pain management doctors can go from two routes: anesthesiology or rehab medicine, and they both end up as pain management doctors. And ketamine is amazing for pain management. So I started looking into that. As an anesthesiologist, we do a lot of pain management, and I realized that a lot of that overlaps. Chronic pain does overlap with a lot of other psychiatric issues, depression, PTSD. It's different flavors of the same issue that needs to be treated. And it's just kind of misfiring of neurons and brain cells. So as I was using it for pain management, I wanted to look into as much research as possible, what studies were being done on it. And depression, anxiety, and PTSD kept popping up. And that's kind of how it branched off. And psychiatry is a great specialty, but they're not comfortable managing the medication side of it. They can write prescriptions for pharmaceutical pills, but actual infusions and anesthetic medications, most of them are not comfortable doing. So there had to be some kind of collegial, relationship between the psychiatrists that wanted to use it for their patients and anesthesiologists who wanted to be the ones to administer it to the patient. So I kind of just kept delving into that and looking at that.
So what is the common practice around using it outside of a surgical setting? Is there a paradigm set for, okay, we're not going to use this as an anesthetic for a procedure. We're now going to use it post-operative for pain management, or in like a clinical setting from a more psychiatric standpoint for that dissociation property, in maybe diving into, some deeper mental health issues, which kind of seems to be the route that these drugs are headed.
Yeah, it's been going on. The studies specifically for depression, I think, have been going on for over 20 years. And that's been led by psychologists, psychiatrists, and a few anesthesiologists. So that's been going on. They've been trying to make protocols of it outside of the operative setting and just in a clinic setting. And again, pain management was kind of going along the side of it. They have outpatient pain management clinics, and they've been doing infusions of it outpatients because it is a very short-acting medication. So outside of the operating room, we've been using microdosing, which is the kind of the buzzword these days, but low-dose infusions, and it's been progressing from there. It's a popularity thing that is starting to grow. Actually, I've been looking into this for 6 or 7 years, and when I first started, nobody wanted to touch it. Now there are ketamine clinics popping up everywhere, which is a good thing. So it's kind of a social thing. Where do you open up a ketamine clinic what neighborhood's going to allow that, what towns, cities don't really care, because it's the smaller towns where there's not much access to other alternatives. Who's going to allow that? Because there's a lot of pushback to open up these types of clinics. But they are available.
What does a treatment look like? Like I'm a patient. I'm coming in for outpatient ketamine infusion. Like I walk in Canada, I lay down a health card. In America, I lay down a credit card. What is the actual procedure look like? Is it cognitive behavioral therapy overlapped with infusion of drugs? Is it just, putting it in an infusion and you sit with your own thoughts? Like, what is the actual procedure?
Well, I mean, that's a perfect question, because it took us, I guess, a lot of years to figure out that as an option. It used to be just a very cold clinic. You go in, you get your infusion, you go out, and hopefully you get some recovery from it in terms of the psychiatric side of it. Now the big push is to have a therapy session with whatever therapist is there, or if you have your own therapist, to work in concert with having an infusion either before, during, or after a therapy session. You get the best results. So every location is different with what they're willing to offer. The newest ones do offer either you set it up with your own psychiatrist or psychologist to have a session that day, or they have in-house sessions. So you go in with the infusion. Depending on which location, you sit, relax, listen to music, read a book, and then you have a therapy session after, or you have the IV hooked up to you infusing while you're having a therapy session. So you're laying back, relaxed on a recliner and talking things out. There are different experiences. There's no standard for that, which is a good thing because everybody is different. But that is kind of the newest way, and they've found that has the best results. It's not just about the physical experience of getting this dissociation. You really have to work out the problems that are affecting you.
I think that's such an important point, because I have some hippie friends, in my circle, and if you speak to them, a lot of times they'll talk about, hallucinogenic drugs like mushrooms or LSD as like this like sort of thing that provides you this grand awakening or enlightenment or whatever. But they talk about it in such a magical way that it makes me at least think, like, why aren't you, if this is the solution to all of these problems, why aren't all of your relationships perfect? Why aren't you a billionaire? Like what if it has such a profound effect? Like, how come I see these people continuing to struggle with the same things time after time while they bury themselves in these drugs, and what makes them feel like, well, seemingly from the outside nothing is changing. I have no experience with ketamine, so I don't know, but seemingly from the outside nothing is changing, but they feel like so much has changed, and they're telling everyone around them, so much has changed. They're trying to get everybody to do it. It's like this sort of weird phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, there are different levels of treatment and effect from it, and you get that instant effect. Ketamine kicks in a few seconds if it's through the IV, and it lasts for a couple hours. You get this euphoria, and it's not, at the dose you're not tripping, but you get this euphoria, you feel great. But that wears off. The real work has to be done with you on the inside, your actions, your intentions, which is a big thing. You really have to change your outlook at life. This helps you reset and kind of start over with what direction you want to go in. But it's not going to change you unless you're willing to work on it with the actual psychological aspect of it.
When I think that's a really good point, because I think maybe what some of these drugs can do is help you have those realizations, like you said, but it's still up to you to do the work, and once you've acknowledged that there's an issue, actually do it outside of the treatment, right? I think maybe a lot of people get stuck in this sort of like loop of feeling good about having a realization, and it's enough to sort of just keep them still. They're like, oh, I've realized the problem, and then that provides them time of like not feeling guilty or something, and then after a certain period of time they feel guilty again, and they'll have another session and do that, and it's just this weird loop, like on repeat. So it's good to hear that you have a plan for people. Like, I think the therapy part of it has got to be super important. Otherwise you can just get stuck in that weird feedback loop.
But I think, like, obviously by the sounds of it, the micro dose isn't micro enough to be blinded to the patient, right? Like, you can never do a double blind study with this, because like someone's gonna be like, okay, I know this IV has the saline solution, and I know this IV has the ketamine, right? So the micro dose is still active enough or bioactive enough that the person's going to be like, okay, like here we go. I guess
Right.
my question is, I mean, because I grew up in a town that's very much riddled with prescription pain medication abuse, right? So like fentanyl, OxyContin, Percocets, like these are street drugs. Like, and the overprescription. I scratched my cornea when I was 19, and they handed me a bottle of 45 Percocets, and like I had my shit together relative to those around me, but like this bottle's worth a couple $100 if I just go out in the street, or it's worth my life if someone knows I have it and they want it and I don't want to give it to them, right? So I'm always like, and then having friends in similar circles that have these cyclical realizations with hallucinogenic drugs, and it's I compare it back to kind of my world and with performance enhancing drugs, where it's like in a sports setting, I know kids that will walk in the gym the first day and start bagging gear. It's just steroids without ever working out, and they get great results, but then the training drops or the gear stops and the training stops. Where it's like, I know guys that have lifted for a decade and then they start running gear. I kind of look at this with like, from a cognitive standpoint with these types of drugs. It's like, I guess to circle back to my question, it's what prerequisite of maybe like seeing a psychiatrist, seeing a psychologist, seeing a cognitive behavioral therapist, or is it, you know, because I'm trying to parse out where the benefits of ketamine being like a dissociative, like the mechanism of it being dissociative being beneficial to as an adjunct to these other, like doing the actual work as it were, versus like, you know, do you have to do 12 therapy sessions without drugs before the ketamine? Like what is the research, or what is like the boots on the ground feeling of like, okay, no, we're not just going to give you drugs and a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a cognitive behavioral therapist. You have to do that stuff first. Like how do you start to intertwine and really pre-qualify someone for ketamine being like a drug that could help along this like path of recovery?
Yeah, I that's also a great question. So there's no standard, which is one of the problems. This is a relatively new, I guess, field. It's very slow growing, but now it's beginning to take off. There is no standard, but I would say it is irresponsible just to take on a patient who walks through the door and not know their history, what's going on with them. Right now, it is reserved for treatment-resistant depression, treatment-resistant, so they have to try other mainstream treatments first and fail those in order to qualify. But that's a judgment call. I'm sure there are some clinics available that you walk in and you have a credit card and they'll say you're good enough, we'll hook you up. But to be responsible, I think you have to establish a background on the patient, make sure that they are seeing somebody. It's also irresponsible, I would think, to give somebody a medication that is going to affect their psychiatric well-being one way or another without knowing that they have support, without knowing if they have a therapist of some sort and they have good support when they walk out that door. So that would be a requirement, in my opinion. Unfortunately, there is no standard requirement. But yeah, I think they would have to be diagnosed ahead of time. I wouldn't feel comfortable as a non-psychiatrist therapist to be the one to diagnose somebody with severe depression and treatment-resistant depression. So I think they have to have, yeah.
Are psychiatrists and therapists referring patients to you? Is that how the process works?
Yeah, that should be the ongoing part. There are psychiatrists that kind of do it on their own. They do the infusions. They set up somebody to do it, but they're the ones that manage it completely. So yeah, that would be the goal. Ultimate goal is to have kind of a network of referrals, and there should be an active participant in it, because you do want those therapy sessions during the ongoing infusions, whether in real time during the same day or just over the series of infusions. You want them to work on the actual progress with the patient. And just to go back, the dissociative effect, that is kind of the more popular known effect of the ketamine, but at the doses that we're giving, they should be wide awake, able to read a book. They just feel a mild euphoria. They shouldn't be in the K-hole or zonked out or anything like that. And the research is still going on. We don't actually know what is causing the benefits of ketamine. It is the dissociative effect to one aspect, because they do studies where they block that, and the decrease in effectiveness has been shown, so that it does help somewhat. But there is some relief of depression even when they don't dissociate. So it's not necessarily that. It's a lot of things that they're working on, that the ketamine works on, that we find is kind of a conglomerate of benefits. The one thing, and I think I kind of briefly mentioned to you back in FitCon, but actually the rearborization of neurons. So it regrows new dendrites. So you're actually repairing some brain damage that's caused by chronic illnesses like chronic depression, PTSD, anxiety. So there actually are physical changes in the brain that have been shown from the actual stimulation of the receptors from the ketamine. So that kind of is a long-term effect. And like I mentioned before, this medication wears off in 4 to 6 hours, usually even a lot less than that. But the effect of the ketamine lasts for days to weeks. And if you do a session, a series of infusions, which usually is about 3 weeks, so 2 infusions a week for 3 weeks, some people do see effects for up to 6 months afterwards. So it's not the actual effect of the ketamine, but it's the changes that occur physically in the brain from it.
But on the backs of that, understanding a little bit deeper about the neurophysiology and, like, to a certain degree, the biochemistry, with that, is there a neurophysiological case to be made for potential dependency?
Well, no. So that is a good question. It hasn't been shown. Ketamine has not been shown to be an addictive drug by any means. Again, the euphoric effects, the dissociative effects, all of those, even the pain control effects, the acute ones, wear off within a couple of hours. So there's no withdrawal effect. So that's kind of part of the definition of an addiction or dependence, is there has to be some kind of withdrawal. So when you don't get it, you feel a negative effect. There's no withdrawal effects from ketamine at any realistic use. If you're back in the 70s taking high dose every day, there might be an issue. So the dependency is not been shown, and they've been studying this for a while. It's been around for 50 plus years. But like I said before, any dissociation, any mental vacation can be addictive, even if it's meditation or even going to the gym. So you're not addicted physically to the compound, but if you have a really bad life, you're not happy with it, any removal of that might feel like something that you're addicted to. So that's why you have to work on yourself. And it's like going on any vacation away from a job you don't like. You can go away, but once you go back to that job, you're going to be unhappy. You have to change the work in between those little mini vacations. So ketamine does have changes in the brain, but they haven't been shown to be addictive. It's kind of just the vacation. If you're not focused on the right aspect of the treatment, you're not going to get the outcome that you want.
Is there a place in treatment for putting people in the quote unquote K-hole, or like zonking them out?
Medically, we haven't gotten there yet in the scientific aspect of it. If you want to go more to the spiritual aspect of it, and that may be in the future, there has been very, I guess, artistic and creativity benefits from it, I guess, from artists and just other, even business people. This K-hole, and the deepest level is what they call ketamine death, which is a very interesting name for something where you actually feel like you're dead. You don't die from it, but you feel like you're dead, but you're conscious and aware of feeling dead. I can't explain it, but the feeling of it, I'm sure you have to be there to know what it's like. But when they come back from that, they have a new outlook on life. Some people have gotten benefits from that. I don't think any clinic would offer that. Or at least advertise offering that. That's probably kind of side use. But I mean, there's the medical and aspect of it, and you're kind of digging yourself out of the hole of these chronic illnesses. And then there's the other aspect of how can it improve my already good life? And that might be something, an adventure somebody wants to go on. Again, I'm not advocating for that because we have to go about this responsibly. But that's something that the future might hold. People who want to increase creativity, might want to have this unnatural experience of feeling dead.
What might be the major differentiation, with the podcast culture seems to be what drives this, is it really picks off a particular audience. But if someone were to come to you and be like, okay, psilocybin, DMT, ketamine, where is it that ketamine, how does ketamine fit into this conversation? What are the pros versus cons? Because I know the frog venom guys that are just licking toads and stuff just to find source, but it's you're sitting here wearing scrubs in a doctor's office, but you also need to have this conversation amongst a sea of people who are just left a Grateful Dead concert. You're just like, fuck, how do I navigate this professionally? So what's the major difference between like these drugs that are coming from both the spiritual, artistic, maybe even an abuse standpoint, and trying to have a very clinical conversation and trying to help people that otherwise might not be able to be reached?
Yeah, the two that I would focus on are ketamine versus psilocybin, which are the mushrooms, because those are the ones that have, in my eyes, from the research, have the greatest potential to be more mainstream. Ayahuasca, DMT, peyote, all these other things are probably used safely elsewhere, but they're probably also used unsafely quite often. So I would not recommend even kind of looking at that. But psilocybin is becoming legalized in many cities and towns. You can't stop it because it grows everywhere. After a nice rainfall in Hawaii, it's going to pop up everywhere. So you can't stop people from getting access to it. I would say the main benefit of ketamine, that the pro ketamine is, it's very easy to control the dose. It's lab made. We could do it by weight. We could do it by effect. We do it under the clinical setting. It goes into the bloodstream directly. 100% of it is bioavailable if you do an IV infusion. And you can do it real time and see what the effects are and titrate the dosage, titrate the effects. It's it's the cold scientific kind of objective. We can exactly change the dose and get the effect we want side of things. That's the benefit of it. The con of it is, if it's used irresponsibly, it can be dangerous. It's very hard to kill somebody with ketamine because, again, the worst you can really do is put them in the K-hole. It's going to wear off. But if they do have medical conditions, there are some reactions that can have. If they have pulmonary issues, they could have very high blood pressure in the lungs. If they have hypertension, this brings their blood pressure even higher. So if somebody's very sick, they could have a stroke. They could have this. But for the normal 95% of the relatively healthy people, it's not going to have that effect at normal doses, especially not the lower dose infusions. But it does have a risk of abuse. Like any other, it's a controlled substance. You have to have a DEA license to have access to it. And luckily it preserves the airway, unlike narcotics and opioids, so you're not going to stop breathing even if you take too much. But it's, nothing's safe if you don't know what you're doing and you're just going to go wild with it. So there's a con to that. When it comes to psilocybin, the pro is it's dirt cheap. Literally, it grows everywhere. You can probably grow your own if you need to. The con is it's probably not going to be as effective as scientifically based infusion of ketamine. The effects, you probably, we're doing a lot of research on that, not we, but the research in general in the scientific community is seeing, there's legalization, so they're very interested in that. They see a lot of positive effects of microdosing these mushrooms in pill form. Unfortunately, that's where the money is coming in, because now these big companies are starting to salivate and look how they can capitalize on it. But it might be a ongoing treatment. It shows actually a lot of similar effects on the brain chemistry as ketamine, but not as strong, not as effective. We don't know how to stabilize the dose. If you grow something in your backyard, you don't know exactly how much you're getting, how strong those particular mushrooms are.
Oh, sure. And the variance is large too, right? Like there's all these different strains. You can have one strain that takes you to the moon, and you have another one that puts you in the corner in a fetal position, sucking your thumb.
I struggle medically in having, we have friends who refer to mushrooms as medicine, and it's just like, well, they're not wearing scrubs, let's say, when they're telling us this. Right. But it's like, I have a hard time getting behind anything that one of the strains is called penis envy. I was like, I don't know how many years of med school this guy has. Fuck this. I'm not taking it. Where this does seem like everything you're saying more appealing from a clinical sense, as it's more controlled. Now, what is the prerequisite? Like, how is it that you, even as an anesthesiologist, like what are pre-op questions that you'd ask to maybe rule this in versus rule this out, either in a pre-op or in like a therapeutic sense?
Well, first you have to go with the history and physical. You want to look at the medical conditions that's going to rule them out. So if they have a seizure history, you don't want to mess around with that. If they have history of psychosis, you don't want to give any hallucinogen or anything that's associated, because they might have a psychotic break. It's very unlikely, but you want to decrease any bad effects. And if they just have an allergy to it, one of those things, bad reactions in the past. So you want to rule out all the medical contraindications. Then you have to get a feel from them and talk to them And like I said, you want them to make sure that they have a good foundation in terms of therapy, that they're already seeing, that they've sought out other treatments in the past that hasn't worked. You, of course, want to rule out the fact that they're acutely suicidal. You really want to, how emergent is this situation? You don't want to treat somebody in an outpatient office who's acutely suicidal and just kick them into an Uber to go home. That's not safe. But then you have to get to know your patients. They're human beings. You have to get a feel as to what their real intentions are. Are they serious about this? Do they just want an escape, like we discussed before? Are they just looking to score drugs and have a lot of extra money on hand that want to, pay for the most expensive form of it? What's their intention? Are they not understanding what the use is for this? Do they just hear that it's good and they don't understand that they have to put work into it? What's the likelihood that they're going to get positive outcomes? So that's kind of how you weed them out. But the most important thing is first do no harm. You want to make sure that they don't have any issues that is going to make them worse than they already were when they walked in the door.
Yeah, I think to your point, for me to consider something medicine, there has to be a medical professional between you and the thing.
Really? Your shroom dealer doesn't classify as a qualified physician?
Yeah, I think a lot of the times people, they mask it that way so they don't feel irresponsible, but they just really want an excuse to do drugs. It's like we were talking about the other day. It's like, I'm not a cocaine addict. I just love the smell.
But for me, do you have any reservations around pushing this agenda forward? And we've seen a trend in these things rise up in popularity through different social media outlets, and then legislation follows soon after. I never thought in my lifetime growing up that we would see the legalization of marijuana, and then within 5 years of the legalization of marijuana, right, it was Washington State and Colorado. Then it's widely decriminalized across most of the United States within 5 years, and within that 5 years, beginning the process of legalizing psilocybin. So it seems like the half-life on government oversight and leniency towards more what we may have thought as more experimental drugs is turning over quicker and quicker. But just as they gain popularity in clinical setting, they also gain popularity in a recreational setting. Do you have any apprehension about talking about this from a clinical standpoint, but also maybe understanding the potential reverberation of recreational use? I guarantee that, and this, not to throw you under the bus for this, but I guarantee someone will listen to this and they'll be at a party and someone will be it'll be a New Year's somewhere. They'll be out in the fucking desert somewhere and someone will be like, oh, I got some purple K or something. And next thing you know, they just K out and see God and they feel good about some realization, and then they come back and then it's medicine again. Do you worry about maybe the other branch that this takes into the recreational field in trying to, your aim is set at, PTSD, things that can't be overcome with just conventional therapy, but maybe there's another branch to this popularity that might push this legislation across the board that might also increase recreational use?
Yeah, that's my main concern is you have to get it out there and available, but you have to get it out there responsibly. And if you just plaster everywhere advertising and say it's a cure-all, it's going to peak really fast and then fizzle out. Something's going to backfire. So it has great effects, but you don't want bad publicity. Ketamine, first thing everybody asks is, isn't that a horse tranquilizer? Isn't that a party drug? It already has a bad name, and then people stopped using it for decades since people forgot about it. So now it's slowly creeping back up, and we're trying, you have to rebrand it as, hey, this is a real medication again. It's not a veterinarian drug and it's not a party drug. There's no way to prevent people from abusing it, which we just have to decrease that as much as possible. The other aspect of it is who's going to control this new field. And I mentioned before, it's a generic medication, so nobody owns a patent on it. But Johnson & Johnson found a way to start making money off of it. And what they did, they have Janssen is the Johnson & Johnson brand of pharmaceutical company. And they patented Spravato, which is just one shape of the molecule of ketamine. It comes in two mirror images. They found a way to isolate just half of that, and they got a patent on it. So they own a new patent on ketamine. It's called Spravato. It's a nasal spray. The goal for getting a patent on it is to get FDA approval, which they got. So for the treatment of depression, ketamine is FDA approved only for the Johnson & Johnson brand. It's a nasal spray because they found a way to isolate half of it. It's still extremely expensive, and they own the monopoly on that. You can get it generic again, but insurance won't cover generic medication that's off-label use.
So someone with depression can just walk around on the streets squirting ketamine up their nose?
No, well, it's still regulated in the sense that you have to go to a doctor's office, has to be prescribed. It's usually an observed nasal spray. They spritz it up your nose, and then they watch you walk out. You don't get to walk around with it. They do it at the doctor's office.
Oh, okay.
But some insurances do cover it. It's not very effective from what I could tell. The nasal route is less than 50% bioavailability versus intravenous route. But Johnson & Johnson, again, they own the monopoly on prescription ketamine for depression. The other aspect, the same with shrooms, that's going to become more mainstream. It's already available, but there are now giant corporations taking over. Now that it's becoming legalized, they're at the forefront. They're not really physicians by any chance. They don't really care about the patients, but how can we get these new psilocybin clinics opened up as soon as they become legalized? They're not available yet, but these corporations already set up camp in a lot of places. And back to ketamine, there's something called Field Trip Health. I'm not going to call them out, but they're a giant corporation. They're opening up clinics everywhere. They're not independent physicians practicing, so they're gaining control of that, and they can control the legislation. It's extremely difficult now to open up a ketamine clinic. It was easy when nobody knew about them. Now it's hard to jump through all the hoops of that. The DEA kind of put a squash on any distributors approving ketamine orders for these clinics unless they kind of jump through these needless hoops. So we're kind of already getting that backlash because it's so inexpensive, and it's a competition with the pharmaceutical industry when it comes to these treatments.
Quick shout out to our sponsor, LMNT. It's a great tasting electrolyte drink mix with everything you need and nothing you don't. That means lots of salt with no sugar. LMNT is formulated to help anyone with their electrolyte needs and is perfectly suited for folks following a keto, low carb, or paleo diet. LMNT contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio: 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, 60 milligrams of magnesium, with none of the junk. No sugar, no coloring, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. If you want to check these guys out, this is something that Stephanie and I use all the time. Check them out at drinklmnt.com/hybrid. This podcast episode is also brought to you by Beam. Beam is committed to producing high-quality, natural, innovative wellness products trusted by some of the world's top professional athletes. Beam creates products to support 4 main categories: balance, performance, recovery, and sleep. These products are combined of both CBD and non-CBD ingredients. By tapping into how we function biologically, CBD can work to regulate pain, mood, appetite, anxiety, and inflammation. As a Hybrid Unlimited listener, you get 15% off your order with code HYBRID in all caps. So check them out. That's Beam, and use code HYBRID in all caps for 15% off.
Would you be at all concerned that, maybe as the popularity grows, because the last question was more geared towards our recreational drug dealers, but now
right. Yeah.
our lobbyist drug dealers, you mentioned Johnson & Johnson, would you be at all concerned that if the bottom line is maybe the bottom line financially, that at some point, these infusion clinics can be allowed to, under stricter regulations pop up? Would you be at all concerned that if the bottom line is ultimately this drug, and that a physical clinic is maybe bottlenecked in its ability to administer this drug, that then prescription ketamine not over the counter, but prescription ketamine post or inter infusion, in between infusions, then might be prescribed just as a means of pushing more ketamine and pushing more profit?
I hope it doesn't go there. I don't think it will, because again, it's hopefully a relatively temporary treatment. You might need some booster infusions or booster doses in the future, but again, it's meant to change your entire outlook on life and change things long term. So it's not a daily pill like a Zoloft or any other antidepressants. So I'm hoping it doesn't become so mainstream that people are lining up at these kind of getting their prescription filled and popping these all the time. So it shouldn't be a long-term treatment. That's always a worry, though, that it gets in the wrong hands, and it's all about money, how we can make it available for profit versus actual beneficial outcome of it. I hope it doesn't go that way though.
For just to switch gears a little bit, for me,
Yeah.
it's hard for me to wrap my head around some like a drug, especially one with this sort of like cognitive impact, being healthy, right? Like when I think of drugs, I associate guilt. Like you drink alcohol, kills brain cells. Like that's how I've always been, like we've learned our entire lives, growing up in school, say no to drugs, all that stuff, right? They really nail that into you. So I'm curious. You already talked about a little bit of the exclusionary criteria for people, you know, and most of it is if they have underlying issues or previous issues or, you know, psychosis or all these different things. But if you're a well-adjusted person with a great life, you're happy and you're coming into this clinic, is there a physical or mental negative side to the use of this drug?
It can be a very scary experience. You have to be prepared. You have to have an intention. You have to understand that you might fight through some demons during this time that you may have not known you had. So it's not always a happy euphoria. You do get the somewhat euphoric state in terms of you feel kind of disconnected from your body somewhat, and you just feel like a load is lifted off you. But if you've got these underlying demons, it may not always be a pleasant experience. They have bad trips like anybody else. At even low dose, you just feel unwell. There is a little bit of nausea, a little bit of headache that some people feel. So it's not always perfect, and we try to decrease those side effects. But again, I think we're far away from somebody who's happy and healthy taking this medication. You have to weigh the benefits and the risks involved and the downside. So if you have no reason to take it, if you might have some negative effects and kind of you're worse off at least temporarily than if you just enjoy the rest of your day and go for a walk. But in the future, like I said, it might be an enhancement medication where you do have a good, happy life, but you want to expand a little more. You want to help this neuroplasticity. Again, we can go into the neuroscience a little, but it might help you learn things. Your brain kind of gets stuck in place as you age. When you're a child, you're flexible. You can learn new things. The research and science is going where this might help increase neuroplasticity. If you want to pick up a new language, this will help. You're not going to wake up like the Matrix and know Kung Fu, but it'll help you retain some of the stuff. It'll help your brain mold. That's what plasticity means. You can remold stuff and pick up new tricks. That might be the future, kind of just a recreational enhancement during aging. So that's a potential.
Now, I know you're not a shaman and that you're a professional. And I know we're drawing a lot of comparisons between other drugs that we've either had, a few degrees removal of experience with. But I kind of, for some reason at least, feel like they're along the same vein in you're trying to achieve ego death and like all those things. So, I mean, I talk to people who talk about ayahuasca or taking large amounts of mushrooms or whatever, and achieving that ego death, and then having that completely new outlook on life. And my question has always been, like, is that always a good thing? Like, let's say I work on Wall Street, I'm making millions of dollars, I go on this ayahuasca retreat, and I have this new outlook on life. I decide everything's pointless, and now I just want to wear ponchos and hang out in the woods, It's like, okay, like your brain has switched to a different line of what you care about, but is there a risk for that? Like, is it always a positive switch?
Well, it's a subjective thing, I guess. What's positive? Maybe that person's happy wearing the poncho. It may not be good for society if we have nobody who wants to be strong producers and everybody wants to run out into the woods barefoot. But for that person, it might be what's positive for them. Maybe their life wasn't as happy as they thought, and that their ego deaths pointed them in a direction where that Wall Street life wasn't really for them, or they're just tired of it. It's hard to judge what's positive and negative for somebody as long as they're not harming themselves. If their change in life is something they decide, I don't know if I can judge whether or not that's a positive thing or say it's a negative thing for them to give up, what they have. From the outside, it may not, people who want that life and they see someone giving it up, it may not be positive. There's always a chance. It really depends on what molded them up into that point and what life decisions and experiences they've had. And maybe that kind of strive for perfection and advancement was a defense mechanism from something they had, and they gave that up, and now they don't feel like they have to keep pushing so hard. I'm not sure. That might be a possibility.
If you were to sit down with a lawmaker and plead an anecdotal case, because like it's fun for us to ask the questions about our our ridiculous friends who lick toads and shit and pretend to be woke for 3 days, tell you all about it, like, oh, you got to do this thing and go to Sedona and get real high and run around and put paint on your face, all this bullshit. And it's like, look, I got a fucking job, man. Like, I can't be doing this all the time. But I want to get back to maybe like more clinical importance. And like, so if you were to sit down with a lawmaker and talk about an anecdotal case in your practice of like, look, we know unequivocally that ketamine infused treatment therapy has changed this person's life from the better, whether it's PTSD, depression, and obviously like HIPAA violations, like you don't need to use names or anything, but cases of otherwise untreatable. Like what is your starting lineup? What is your closer anecdotal case of like, look, here's a patient we had that nothing else worked. They tried X, Y, and Z, and then all of a sudden the ketamine treatment was it. Like, what is your go-to like professional anecdotal experience to maybe shine a more positive light away from our dumb drug addict friends?
Yeah, I ironically, I would think one of the best anecdotal things isn't depression or anxiety related, but is actually pain control related, because we do want to avoid opioids. There's that epidemic there that we really want to fight. When I was doing spine surgeries as an anesthesiologist, I was doing the anesthesia for it. We would do these 7-8 hour cases where they would just put metal rods all the way up their back from neck to butt. And they get infusions of all sorts of medications for that 7-8 hours to keep them asleep and comfortable and pain-free. And one of them is a narcotic, and you give them a very quick-acting narcotic, but a continuous infusion for 7 or 8 hours. And that was found to have rebound hyperalgesia. What that means is when you stop it, they have extreme pain, even if they're not having pain. Just removing that narcotic infusion that would give them a lot of pain temporarily, but they have this pain that more than if they just didn't get the narcotic. So when I first started in my town here, I had trained giving ketamine infusions for these long spine cases, and the hospital I worked, just started working, didn't do that. So I gave a ketamine infusion to one of these long cases without permission, but I don't need permission. But I gave the infusion. I didn't tell anybody, and the patient went to the recovery room and, was waking up. And I had another case to do, unfortunately, so I started my next case, another long spine case, and I got a phone call from the recovery room from the nurse, who was very frantic and saying that there's something wrong with the first patient. I said, oh boy, I did this ketamine infusion, which they weren't doing before, and now I'm the end. One of my first days on this job, and it's probably my last day. I said, what's wrong? I'm stuck in the operating room here, but what's wrong? I said, well, the patient wants to go up to the floor because they have to stay a couple nights and they're still in the recovery room. They want to go to their room up in the floor already in the hospital. I said, okay, so what's the problem? I said, well, we haven't given them any pain medication yet. I said, so what's the problem? He said, well, he's just awake and looking around the room, and he's saying he's hungry and he wants to go up to his room and spend the rest of the night there. And I kept asking, what's the problem? He said, and she kept saying, we haven't given pain medication yet. We can't send him up to his room. I said, is the patient in pain? And she said, no. I said, so why would you give him pain medication? She said, because we always do. These surgeries are very painful. And I said, I don't understand. If he's not asking for pain medication, he's asking for food, give him his dinner and send him up to his room. And she was so worried because she said, if I send him up to the room without pain medication, I'm going to get in trouble. And I said, do not give him any pain medication. He says he's not in any pain. I gave him a ketamine. That's when I spilled the beans. Said I gave him a ketamine infusion, during the procedure. That's how I was trained to do it. And from that day on, all of our spine cases were done with these ketamine infusions. And the narcotic use went almost to zero from these huge, they're going to have a scar all the way up and down their back. All those metal rods went to almost zero post-op. So that the risk of, opioid addiction and all this chronic pain drops dramatically. So not only that, but the expense. There's a lot of side effects from opioids. There's constipation, which sounds funny, but this costs a lot of money in the hospital treating constipation. There's nausea, vomiting, allergic reaction, itching. Constipation keeps people in the hospital for extra days. If they're not pooping, you can't let them go home. And it sounds funny, but that costs a lot of money for a hospital to keep a patient 2 or 3 extra days just because they can't use the bathroom because they're taking so much morphine. So that alone saved the hospital a lot of money. It might have changed the course of these patients' lives who would otherwise be on these very strong pain medications from this back surgery. almost and down to almost zero pain medication. So I would kind of tell that story. It scared me the first day because again I thought I was going to be fired. The nurse called me frantically, but that was kind of an eye opener for me because I had always trained using these ketamine infusions on these big surgeries, so I didn't know what it was like to not use them. So to see the reaction from people who had always gotten patients in severe pain to now getting a patient who didn't have pain from this big surgery was an eye opener for me to see how beneficial it was because I never saw patients not getting it. So I couldn't tell how effective it was.
So, I mean, out of my own personal professional curiosity, because I'm a chiropractor by trade, so I've dealt with a lot of post-operative laminoplasties, laminectomies, discectomies, you name it, Harrington rods, whatever weird scoliosis, medieval shit goes on. And in your professional experience, towing this line maybe closer to your day-to-day practice, how widely accepted by your colleagues and contemporaries is ketamine infusions? Like, let's say of all the spine surgeries that happen in the U.S. daily, what percentage are doing infused with ketamine, and what percentage isn't?
It's tough to say nationally, but it's actually very well accepted. And again, I think it's part of the social aspect of it. If the patient's asleep and nobody knows what the patient's getting unless you look at the record, it's much easier to administer ketamine without judgment. It's different from outpatient where the patient comes in specifically for ketamine. When the patient comes in for a back surgery, they don't ask what medications they're getting. They just know they're going to be asleep and wake up. So it's actually very common, especially in more current and academic settings. It's kind of the standard of care for a lot of these bigger surgeries. I just happened to have started in a smaller hospital that was a little behind on the times, and I caught them up pretty quick. But I think it's accepted, again, when nobody's really asking what the patient's getting. It's easier to give these medications to them. When it's broadcasted, if we put a billboard saying, hey, you're going to get ketamine for your back surgery, I think that'd be a huge backlash and probably a pushback against it. But I think, again, if nobody knows without looking at the record what the patient's getting, they don't really care as long as the outcome's good. So it's a social aspect of it, I would say.
Would you say the biggest proponents for ketamine outside back surgeries for it, like further therapeutic use around managing pain, whether it be physical or maybe more like psychological, would you say that the biggest proponents are people of your specific designation who have seen the ability for this drug to work day in, day out, its safety, its efficacy? Like, are other pain management doctors the other ones like towing the front lines of this movement to normalize ketamine use in maybe an alternative therapeutic setting?
I would say, follow the money. And unfortunately, it's not covered by insurance. And nobody really who's making the money already as a pain management doctor doing injections. And, they don't want to be wasting their time being the forerunners and pushing this. They'd rather just give the injection, get insurance to cover it, get their money. So there's not as much incentive unless they're being altruistic. There's not incentive for them to have a more effective treatment, but doesn't pay them as much. They'd rather, and I'm not judging a whole specialty, but there is incentive for somebody to come back every 6 months for an injection, who still has a complaint, who still has pain, and you can bill insurance for a treatment, rather than the incentive to treat somebody and say, hey, you don't have to come back unless you want to, see how it is, and give me $500 cash and we'll call it even. Some people would rather put a neurostimulator in and get $6,000 back. So it's tough to say, I can't say all these people are bad or good, but if you take a step back and look at the incentive, it would not be to push this type of treatment. Because nobody, unless you're a corporation, is going to become very rich off of this. It takes a lot of individual care for these patients. Infusions are about an hour each. The going rate is between $400 to $600 for an infusion, which sounds like a lot, but you got to pay your staff, you got to pay for insurance, you got to pay everything. What you take home is, very little per hour when you could be working in the hospital and just doing general anesthesia or general pain medicine and making several $100s per hour. So the incentive is not to be rich off of this, and that's kind of one of the deterrents for the physicians who are pushing it. Yeah, so you kind of have you have the altruistic movements.
Yeah, dish out like Norco and gabapentin, make your money, buy your boat, put your house on the water, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are pain management doctors, and this is anecdotal, but they'll have a stack of pre-filled prescriptions, and they'll have a stack of gabapentin, a stack of this, and then they'll just write your name on it. You walk in, they'll see you for 35 seconds, and bill the insurance company for a half-hour visit, and they can see 50 patients a day that way. 50 patients times half an hour is much more than one day, but they squeeze that into 24 hours somehow, billing wise. So
you see that in
the incentive.
A lot of fields too. I remember in university how many kids were selling Adderall just because it was just like overprescribed. Some kid would go in and say, I have ADHD. It's like that South Park episode. They get them to read the entire book, and they're like, what happened on page 1 or page 80, paragraph, whatever? No one knows. They're like, you all have ADHD. And they're just throwing out pills. But yeah, I think that overprescription happens a lot in every field.
Yeah, it's actually so, Adderall, Ritalin's a good example of a social medication too, where depends on where you are in society is whether or not how you see Ritalin or Adderall. There are lower socioeconomic people look at Ritalin and say, I don't want you putting my kids on these drugs. It's bad. You're just trying to dope up my child. And then the higher socioeconomic class will say, hey, I want my child to have an advantage over other people. Put them on Ritalin so they can study more. It's the same medication, same outcome, but some parts of society love the medication, want their kids on it. Other parts say, no, leave my kid alone. It's the same with any new treatment or any treatment that will change you. It's finding the right patients, right clientele. There are people who don't mind getting an injection, don't mind whatever insurance will cover to treat their illness. And then there's other patients who say, I want something that works. I don't care how much it costs. I don't care if insurance will pay for it. There's a lot of battles to fight in terms of making this mainstream. And the incentive is a little backwards. So you kind of just have to hope it works out.
Do you ever think about, if the goal was to ultimately just get it more mainstream, if we look at the trend of what it takes for a drug to become more mainstream, regardless of the negative effects, like, fentanyl is one that comes to mind, OxyContin is one that comes to mind. It's like, is the Johnson & Johnson, strain, different chirality, whatever it is, the patent they have, the likely route in the way this goes down, like just understanding how like med legal lobbyists sort of work, that it's like, all right, J&J is going to be expensive, but maybe that's exactly what we need to put the billables at a point where practitioners will start paying attention to this, rather than like, it's the generic like $1 per dose. It's basically the exact same thing, the exact same outcome. The only difference is the income. Right, like in all things equal, in your experience and how this stuff actually goes down, do you think that the big pharma route to incentivize the practitioner to veer the attention towards this is likely how this starts to become viable?
Yeah, it's tough because I think the way that Johnson & Johnson's benefiting from it is they are the only game in town in terms of FDA approval, and we can give up and say, here, just take it, it's yours, but at least make it available to the people. It would be hard to trust them on doing that and doing it at an affordable rate. And the other aspect of it is they already have plenty of medications that they're making a lot of money off of that are competitors of ketamine. They work a lot less effective, and the patients need a lot more of it, so they make a lot more money on that. So if you give them control, they might just put it on the back shelf again and shut it down, and then nobody has access to it. So you have to trust a pharmaceutical company. I don't know if I'd be willing to do that in terms of their morals and making it available. I would, ideally it would be the continued mom and pop, independent physicians opening up their own clinics and making a national standard. There are a few societies of ketamine prescribing prescribers that are forming, and they have their own conventions and everything. So they try to standardize it so that when you do open up, you can kind of go with how they do it. That would be my ideal route, is just have more independence, more freedom, but have a kind of national consensus of how to go about it and treat patients, so that there's no cowboys doing their own thing and sending people to the K-hole for fun and ruining it for everybody.
What do you see as a realistic timeline for that?
Well, it's kind of funny because ketamine's been around for 50 years. We've been doing research for 20 plus years when it regained its popularity. And then psilocybin and mushrooms came out of nowhere, and they're actually taking the lead. So I don't know what the timeline is, because if they start legalizing microdosing shrooms, that might put the squash on ketamine altogether, because it's much more accessible. You don't need to go to a clinic and get an infusion for it, and probably get a lot less expensive. So that might kind of squash the timeline on ketamine infusions and take the lead. And that looks like it's happening pretty rapidly in terms of legalization and recreational use. I'm not going to poo-poo the benefit of recreational use in terms of making it socially acceptable. I'm not promoting recreational use either. But if people are using it and not, lighting the cities on fire and going crazy, then it might make it more mainstream and more acceptable for society to just say, hey, it ain't so bad. Maybe we should allow it for medical use more often also. So that might be the route. We just kind of have to let people use it at their own discretion, and hopefully they use it responsibly, and that might promote it faster under standard conditions in the future.
Are there countries that do a better job than this than Western countries, Canada and the United States? Like, I know with just different stigmas around drug use, and like Portugal, all drugs are legal. Like, how much does the confines of our legal system in Canada and the United States, the influx of influence of big pharmaceutical companies and lobbyists in Washington especially, how much of a factor do you think that plays, and will we get beaten to the punch by someone overseas, perhaps in like Europe or something like that?
Yeah, it's the countries that legalize everything or decriminalize everything, they also partially take out the incentive for clinicians to use it, because then you're just offering the service of your guidance. You're not offering the product itself, and that decreases because it's available, it's legal. So you're just offering your insight, and that might decrease the incentive. I'm not going to make money just showing you how to use it, because you're going to get it on your own anyway. So part of the benefit of having the DEA regulate these medications and only allowing certain physicians to prescribe it, is that we are incentivized, because we're the experts in it. We're incentivized to be the ones to promote it. It's a balance like anything else. If you're too strict on the regulations, then nobody has access, and if everybody has access, then nobody's going to put the energy into being the leaders of it and helping. I guess they're not going to be famous if everybody has access to it. They're not going to be the ones to be in charge and show people how to use it correctly, because you're not going to make money off of that if they can just get it on their own and not care how to do it. Canada, on the other hand, they I think have been one of the big pushes towards the responsible use of shrooms for severe depression. They kind of took it on their own, and they have these retreats and guided trips, I guess. And they're kind of doing it how I said. They're doing it recreationally, but with a purpose and intent, and they're doing it responsibly. And that has been shown. It has shown society that, hey, they can do it, and people are getting positive effects. And it's not from the pharmaceutical companies prescribing it. It's not from clinicians directing them how to do it. Therapists are helping in some clinicians, but it's from their personal use and their personal experiences, their anecdotal experiences. And it's been okay. Nothing negative has happened. And that's actually been very beneficial in kind of normalizing it.
It's an interesting.
I applaud Canada.
Yeah, it's an interesting line to walk, because on the one hand, thinking like a consumer, I'd rather have cheap access to whatever I want. But then thinking like someone who actually has a problem or underlying demons that I'm trying to work through, I think I'd feel a lot more comfortable having to go through a professional and be guided through that experience. Like, if the alternative is take a bunch of mushrooms and lie in my bed and freak out about all the stuff I should be doing that I'm not doing versus, going to someone like yourself who can guide me through it, like that feels like a much safer place to be, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just feel terrible for him, because like every question we've asked, there's been like there's the optimism and the realism seem to clash, right?
Well, but it's good though, because we're asking the questions we're trying to find like what's the bad part of this drug, basically,
right? And
so far we haven't really found it. So
people are the bad part of the drug, right? Yeah. Like people and money are the worst parts of this drug.
Yeah,
it's not an ideal drug, and again, it doesn't work for everybody. But it's a very useful tool to have, and I think it amplifies and augments therapy, and that's, again, it's changing your lifestyle, changing your outlook and your intention in life. It's very kind of a very Buddhist outlook. You really have to look within yourself to fix it. But this helps you, because I think there are actual obstacles to people. You can't just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to be happy. That's good for inspirational quotes and just change your outlook. But some people, it's really just not physically possible. If you're in chronic pain, it's not realistic to say, I'm going to change my outlook on life. or if you've had a very traumatic experience in life, you can't just say today's the day. It sounds good, but it's not realistic without some help. And this is one of the possible ways to help, is taking these psychedelics.
So you're telling me David Goggins might be wrong as he calls me a bitch as he runs down the side of the road with a car driving next to him? It's nice to have this conversation with someone wearing scrubs, because most of the times it's my bullshit friends that are just like, yeah, no, bro, definitely medicine. So I mean, I feel bad if that, I don't know if that's the right way. Like, you're fighting a seemingly impossible fight, because it's like you're trying to navigate church and state almost, right? Because of like the spirit, which has been as long as there's been religion, there's been battles between these two things. So like, to be able to dive in and have at least even the acknowledgement of the spiritual undertones and like the emotional tied back into the very cold clinical and medical, and the ability to like dose and titrate and control this substance, it seems to pose a very unique set of challenges with this drug more than anything else, because it does toe the more clinical line in administration and dose and manufacturing. Like, you're not just going to go out into the woods, stumble across it, and be high for 8 hours, right? And it's so yeah, I mean, it's an interesting hill that you've chosen to jam a flag into and claim, because that face right there, dude. Oh, and it's just, I don't know. I'm interested to see how this unfolds, because we've seen. You made a comment about it's not a perfect drug. It's not for everyone. But I think that statement right there, like, I have friends, use the term loosely, that are like napropaths or natural, like, yo, I'm a chiropractor. I'm the fakest fucking doctor in the world. But these motherfuckers are working on a whole nother level of bullshit. It's like,
yeah.
That is the perfect drug. The perfect drug is the one that doesn't work for everyone, because it's the drug that when it works for someone, it really works, right? Like, how much fucking CoQ10 and turmeric can a guy take before I realize that maybe this isn't doing anything, right? And my napropath aunt is just a fucking trumped up drug dealer that works for GNC, right? Where on this side, it's like, it seems to have that exclusion criteria. If you can toe that line properly, like, it seems to be like a much more sure shot in efficacy and effectiveness.
For sure.
Yeah, and to go along that, one of the worries I had, and luckily it kind of calmed down a little bit, is I didn't want psychedelics, especially ketamine, to go the route of CBD oil, which may have some benefits, but then they started putting it in everything, and it was the cure-all, and they advertise it because it's available, and you can get CBD in everything. And no matter what your ailment was, it's going to fix it. And in the beginning, they started to look at ketamine that way. And there was research on everything. They used it for COVID. It actually did help treat COVID, but that's another issue. But they started using it to treat everything and see what the effects were, instead of just focusing on what we did see benefit from. And then later on, looking at these other treatments, it started to go everywhere. And it started to look like snake oil. Even though we're having an effect, if you start to make too many claims, like you're going to learn a new language, like I mentioned earlier, then people start to have disbelief from it. So luckily, I try to be a realist. It's not perfect. Even with its intended use for what we know now, it's not going to cure anybody. It's going to hopefully, at best, give them the tools for them to change their life and lifestyle and outlook to improve themselves. Some people may get positive, almost a cure, and have very tolerable life, and